Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Jane Gunn and I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Medicine, Dentistry and Health Sciences at the University of Melbourne, and I'd like to thank you for joining us for tonight's discussion, Tips to Help Families Cope During Lockdowns. But before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the elders, both past, present and emerging, of the Wurundjeri people who are the custodians of the land that I'm on. And I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which you're on this evening. Tonight's event is part of the faculty's In Pursuit of Health series. And this series aims to bring the community together to discuss issues that are important to them. And to coincide with the milestone of the 150th anniversary of the Royal Children's Hospital, this year's series of In Pursuit of Health is focused on child and adolescent health. Just a few weeks ago, we hosted a discussion on pre-teens and screens. And based on feedback from that event, which was really successful, we've put together tonight's panel who will share insights and provide tips and strategies that we hope will help you, our community of parents and their children living in lockdown. And we note how difficult it is for many of us at this time. The discussion will go for around 40 minutes, and then there'll be some time for audience Q&A for the last 15 minutes. And I'm delighted this evening that I'm joined by a fabulous panel, and I'd like to introduce you to Professor Sarath Ranganathan, who'll be moderating the discussion. Sarath is the Stevenson Chair and Head of the Department of Paediatrics at the University of Melbourne. And he is joined by Dr. Michael Carr-Gregg, who's a child and adolescent psychologist, author and broadcaster. We also have Dr. Anthea Rhodes, paediatrician and founding director of the RCH National Child Health Poll. Professor Lena Sanchi, who's a general practitioner and head of the Department of General Practice at the University of Melbourne. And also Professor David Coghill, who's a professor of child and adolescent psychiatry at the Royal Children's Hospital and holds the Financial Markets Foundation Chair of Developmental Mental Health at the University of Melbourne. And joining them is Zoe Daniel and her teenage son, Archie, to share their experiences of living in lockdown as a family. So I'd like to welcome everyone to this panel this evening. I look forward to hearing the discussion, and I'll be back with you at the end. But now over to you, Sarath, for tonight's panel.
Thanks very much, Jane. And I'd also like to welcome everybody to this panel discussion. Really pleased that you could join us this evening, and very grateful to allow us to zoom into your homes late this evening. And there've been at least 2,000 registrants for this, and I think you'll agree that that probably indicates that many families are looking to get tips on how to manage lockdown. And I have 3 children myself, and I can appreciate some of the challenges that many of you are facing and that we've all had to face over the last 18 months as we've tried to negotiate the challenges that have been put upon us by the pandemic itself. So what we're really hoping to do is to provide you with some practical tips and things that you could actually adopt as you wake up tomorrow and for the days onwards. The first person I'd want to welcome to this panel is Zoe Daniel and her son Archie. Zoe, thanks for joining us today. Could you tell us what sort of challenges you and your family have faced with lockdowns?
Hi, Sarah, and thank you so much for having us. Look, I think our experience would be similar to most people's, but I think what I found most noticeable during this latest lockdown is the sort of cumulative effect of repeat lockdowns. Last year, things felt a little different. It was new. There was a sense of perhaps relief from busy life in many ways, and we were able to fill time doing things that we perhaps wouldn't otherwise have done as a family because we didn't have time to do them. So lots of cooking and doing jigsaws and bike riding and those sorts of things. But 6+ lockdowns in, those things are starting to lose their novelty value. And there's a sense of not only monotony, but just when will this ever end? And how do you progress not only as a family, but as an individual through that? So I think what my husband and I have noticed with the kids, so Arky's 14 and a half and his sister Pearl is almost 13, is just a sense of having to try a lot harder to keep them motivated, to keep them and us with a sense of moving forward. And, you know, as adults in the family, you kind of want to be leading your family through this and trying to motivate the kids and support them through it. But of course, we have our days too, especially Monday mornings in lockdown. I think you kind of wake up and go, oh, here we go, heading into another week, waiting on those daily numbers and having that sort of flat plunge each morning. So it's just a case of having to think a lot harder about how we keep ourselves positive through all of that.
Yeah, thanks. And I'll move over to Arky. You've heard your mum talk there. What have you found to be particularly hard?
Well, I think last year it was like way harder in terms of motivation. Like I found that my parents were encouraging me to be way more active than I was myself. But I think this lockdown, I've really improved in motivating myself and finding ways to go out and, you know, be fit and stay active even during lockdown. I've found that it's been really inconsistent though in terms of motivation, especially like some days I'll be buzzing and I'll really want to get out and, you know, go for heaps of runs, do workouts and stuff. But then I'll have other days like this morning, I was just so tired and I was hot and I was sore and I just woke up and I was like, I couldn't go do anything. So I think it really changes daily, weekly.
I think you probably hit the nail on the head, because I imagine lots of people are experiencing the same thing, where the energy levels are up and down, and you're trying to sort of restore those energy levels each day. Thanks very much for that answer. I'm going to ask Lena now, because Lena, you're in contact with all your colleagues in general practice. They must be seeing people who are reporting these sorts of problems. What do the general practitioners that you know comment on?
Yeah, yes, Sarah, indeed. Zoe and Arky's experiences are very common out there, and particularly that cumulative effect that you were talking about, Zoe, and that difficulty in getting the motivation this time round, number 6. But GPs are seeing increased numbers of children, young people and families that are experiencing issues maybe for the first time, and coming forward not having had a background of stress or mental health experiences in the past. And some have had reactivation of problems that they've had in the past. So maybe parents or young people are experiencing a reactivation of something they might have had as an adolescent or later. And we're seeing this with eating disorders, for example. And then those that have mental health issues are often having that exacerbated and even more challenging. Some are experiencing more relief, I guess, with some of the high anxiety disorders, but many are finding it more challenging with the isolation. So these are very commonly presenting, as well as the issues of disengaging a bit with school or increased irritability, and in the more extreme cases, some experiences of violence and abuse in families, which GPs are having to deal with. So some of my colleagues are telling me that around 80% of their consultations will have a component that's related to a mental health concern or needing some advice about coping and getting on in this later stage. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Lena. 80% sounds like a hell of a lot.
A lot. Mm.
And I think what our aim here is to try and find some practical strategies. So I think it'd be a good time to go over to Michael. Michael, if we could think about perhaps some of the things that parents might be able to do. So Zoe, for example, what advice would you be able to give?
Thank you, Sarah. Look, there are probably 4 things that I'd recommend. The first is, I think it's up to the parents to set the emotional tone to be alert but not alarmed. So I think that we need to basically recognize that young people are great imitators. There's about time that we made sure that we gave them something really good to imitate. I also think that we need to be fairly optimistic. The role of parents at this time is, in my view, to be purveyors of hope, to remind them that the vaccination rates are climbing, that we are making progress. The rates did come down before. There's no reason really why they shouldn't come down again. And I think we need to also remind parents to put on their own oxygen mask first, to make sure that they meet their needs for diet, exercise, and sleep, and connection with other human beings. And probably above all, to schedule their activities for the young people. I think when you've got perhaps young children and you're in lockdown for a prolonged period of time, it's rather like having a blender without a top on it. And what I think we need to do is make sure that we have a written schedule each day, if possible, of things for the young people to do. Obviously, they've got school, which is scheduled, but it's really after school that they need some help. And I saw a rather nice idea the other day of a schedule being written up, and at 4:40 there was a surprise event, which presumably this incredibly creative parent had dreamt up, and the young people were looking forward to it.
Thanks, Michael. Anthea, Michael's brought up some interesting points there. You have a lot of contact with parents through your work as a paediatrician and also through the Royal Children's Hospital poll. Anything you'd like to add or comment in relation to what Michael said there?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Look, I think echoing what others have said, the first thing I'd say, Zoe, is that your experience and that of your family and you, Archie, is really, really common of what we're seeing at the moment. And it's part of what we, if you like, expect in terms of the way we're going to respond to such a huge change and a lot of prolonged stress. We have now had more than 18 months of protracted uncertainty and stress, and this is unprecedented for all of us. And I think it's really important for parents to realise that the way they might be feeling is probably normal for a response to this type of thing. So firstly, don't be tough on yourself that you're not coping or managing the way you should be or you could be, because this type of experience that you are having, as Len has said, reflects 80+% of the population's experience. And, it's part of the way your mind and your body is reacting to a really unforeseen sort of trigger that's gone on for a long time. A couple of practical things, building a bit on what Michael has said. One of the things that we've really lost in lockdown and prolonged lockdown is our rhythm and structure of life. And so you wake up Monday morning and think, what day even is it? Every day starts to look the same. And often in normal life, that rhythm and structure carries us along. So when we're a bit down or we can't be bothered or exhausted, when we have our usual life, we know we have to just get to things. And once you get going and do some of those things, that actually feeds your energy back and you actually get something back and can keep going. So that's where the structure and routine that we hear a lot about, and everyone groans a little bit and feels like it's hard and it's boring. But if you can actually be really quite strict about at least getting up and getting going in a certain way every morning for yourself and your kids, then you will see the flow-on effects for the rest of the day. The other thing that's important that you've talked about is the idea of monotony. So we hear about variety as the spice of life, and someone said to me the other day that we're sort of eating pretty bland porridge at the moment, and that makes it really hard to top up your tank and your energy. Something to look forward to, which is the kind of surprise idea that Michael just talked about, is actually a really, really important way to maintain hope. And so we can be looking forward to when life is normal again, or a version of it, but that's really, really far away and it's not within our control. And for our children, that can feel even further away and even further out of their control. So something else you can do is try to schedule something. It doesn't have to be every day. That's a helpful thing too. But even within a week, to set a bigger thing that you might look forward to, particularly on the weekend, that can give you some change of variety to the way the week looks and something for everyone to look forward to. Those sort of basic things can help to lift everyone and keep them moving. Obviously, that's not always going to be enough. And I'm sure we'll hear a bit more tonight about what you might need to do if things are more than that, particularly for your own mental health as a parent in terms of reaching out and seeking help from friends and family and obviously professionals where you might need it.
Thanks very much. And Lena, anything that you would like to add from a sort of general practice type perspective?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So I think just to build on what Anthea and Michael have both said, I think firstly to Anthea, validating the concerns that you have and just saying that this is probably, we haven't had anything like this since the boomer generation, really, or before the boomer generation, like a world war or a plague or something like that, where the individual's well-being is sort of sacrificed a little bit for the good of the many to get through it. And we're in a time a bit special like that. So our contribution to that has to be understood and in that sort of context. So we will get through it in time. But I think so tapping in on the young people and yourselves about what worries might be, what the anxieties might be, because if they're discussed, then we can discuss them openly and we can work out ways to respond. And I think building on the idea of the blender going like this, I think for parents, it's really useful to be really self-aware of when things might be, you're starting to become overloaded, because all of us do. We're all a bit tetchy at different times. And just having a signal or a flag to say, look, I'm just getting a bit overloaded now. I'm going to take a bit of time to go and out in the garden, run up and down on the spot, take a walk or do something to regenerate, because it's very easy to sort of snap at different times. And it's good to buy yourself some time to recognize those signs and get some time out. And the same is true with our kids, that they will also be reacting in different ways. And it's us being able to kind of accept that and ride with that, not take it personally, and then recognize when they might need our containment and support. So I think those sort of things for parents are important to keep in mind too.
Well, so much good advice. And Zoe, any comments on what you've heard or anything that you found to be particularly helpful in your family situation?
Oh, look, I think the thing for me is trying to find some small positives in each day. And I mean, it so happens timing wise that I came off an incredibly busy job straight into a pandemic. So was literally on planes kind of every couple of days to being completely grounded now for the last 18 months. And there've been some goods and bads in that for me, to be honest. But one of my things is gardening, and we're very lucky that we have a garden. And I sort of have great belief in the thesis that gardening is actually a belief in a future, because when you plant something, then you wait for it to grow. And so I've been putting in some bulbs, for example. My tulips have just come out, and I've put in a whole lot last weekend, which will flower lilies that will flower at Christmas. So that's an investment in, well, we're going to get to Christmas and hopefully by then we'll be out of lockdown and those lilies will be flowering. So it's something that we can watch progress over time. But I think with the kids, and, you know, no doubt Archie will have something to say about this, but the key for them is exercise and getting out of the house, I think, and particularly having two very physical children, especially this one, with, you know, aspirations to play sport. Getting out and bike riding or running or kicking a football is really key. But then that's also part of the disappointment factor too, because of course community sport and school sport has been largely cancelled again the second year in a row. And so from that perspective, again, as a parent, and I'm sure a lot of parents feel this too, I just feel really disappointed for them that the sports that they put so much effort into training so that they can play games, and they've barely played any.
Well, Archie, you've heard your mum talk there about your sport. You're in year 9, aren't you?
Yeah.
What is it that you particularly miss about it during this sort of lockdowns and the pandemic? What do you miss most?
I probably miss just being able to wake up and not have to like think and stress about all the COVID and stuff like that. Like I liked being able to, like I didn't know it at the time and I took it for granted, but I liked being able to just go to my friend's house without having masks and like rules to follow and stuff. But I really connected with what Anthea said about routines. So just before the last lockdown, my mum, not really relating to lockdown, but she was like, you know, you got to get in a routine with your sport and your running and your football, because you're not going to get there. You're not going to come close. And so that lockdown, I really put it on myself to get in a real routine and go running twice a week, Monday and Friday, and then do the stuff that my physio said Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And I really, as much as I didn't look forward to it that much, I really found it way easier to get up and do it, knowing, you know, that I've set this standard for myself and I've got to meet it. And I just found it way easier, and it really helped with not only my fitness, but my mental health going through that lockdown. I had something that I was committed to and that I was doing, and I just really wanted to persevere with.
Well done. I know you said earlier that your energy levels are up and down, but your motivation there is fantastic. I think those are really good tips for others if they could try and match some of those things. And I'm sure at other times, though, it's still quite hard. And I want to actually move on to discuss that a little bit more, because, David, we're hearing more about young children's lack of motivation, and also potentially the impact that's having on young people's well-being. So I'm talking about their mental health now. What sort of things should parents be looking out for in that context, in terms of their children and their teenagers' mental health and well-being?
Well, thank you, Sarah. I think the first thing that's important to look out for are actually the positives, not the negatives. So I think that actually looking for the sparks that are there, even if someone's feeling a bit down, even if they're not feeling themselves, actually looking out for those things that they're doing well. And it's interesting, Zoe and Archie kicked us off, and Zoe was telling us this lockdown has been the worst for me. And we'll come back to why that's important to be able to say. And then Archie said, well, actually, I feel I'm doing better this time than I did the last time. So being able to grab onto those positives. But you're right, there are some children and young people who are really feeling it hard. Many parents and adults as well. I think the things that we've heard about most are increased anxiety, and Archie was telling us a bit about that. So I wake up, I think about COVID, I think about the risks that are there, but not just anxiety about COVID, anxiety about being out, anxiety about, I haven't seen my friends for a while, will they still like me? I haven't been to school for a while. What's that going to be like? And so anxiety is one, loneliness is another. And loneliness isn't really a mental health disorder, but it's certainly a symptom of not having good mental health and good mental well-being. And loneliness has been a real factor for many of us, adults, children, young people alike. And then we have depression and the potential for becoming depressed. I think, again, it's important to recognize all of us. I actually assume all of us on this call, and probably most people that are listening, have had periods of feeling pretty down during the pandemic. And I'll self-disclose that I said this to Sarah last week. I just wasn't feeling great. But I wasn't actually clinically depressed. But there are those who have become depressed, and so we need to look out for the signs. And in children and young people, actually, low mood is often not the predominant sign of depression. Many people have real difficulty telling us that their mood is low, and it may show as irritability. But a lot of other symptoms that we can see: poor sleep, either too much sleep or too little sleep, waking up very early in the morning, a change in appetite. It can be a real loss of appetite or overeating, a loss of motivation that Archie picked up, that's good for him at the moment, which is a great sign, but also decreased activity, and particularly withdrawing into your own space, withdrawing away from family, withdrawing away from contact with peers, even though it may have to be contact over Zoom or contact on the phone or contact by texting on social media. But that kind of withdrawal that's consistent, where you shun contact, where you're not enjoying the things that you usually enjoy. All these are signs of potential for depression. And where you see those, not just for a day or so, because as I said, we've all had it for a day or so, but when you start to see those things consistently, then my alarm bells go and we need to start thinking, should we do something about this?
Thanks, David. There's actually a question that's come through in the chat, and rather than wait to the end, I thought I would just put it to you right now. And that was a question about looking out for children with ADHD or children with autism, children that are neurodiverse. Is there anything that you would say to parents of children with these sorts of challenges?
Yeah, we know that children with ADHD, and we've done some studies to look at them in particular, have found lockdown really, really challenging, because it really challenges many of the areas of life that they already struggle with. And so the issues for them have been similar, but probably more pronounced in many ways, particularly not being able to get out, not being able just to let off that steam, a lot of irritability. Children with autism, autistic children, it's been really quite variable. Many of my autistic patients have said, actually, this has been suitable for us. I don't like to be out in that world that I see as threatening. Homeschooling has been good because I don't have to do the social communication. Now, that doesn't mean that lockdown has been good for them, but it means that they've perceived it and felt it in a different way. But certainly, I've seen other autistic children and young people who have really struggled because their routines have been stopped, because they've not been able to do the things that help them get through life. But certainly, as I think the questioner was alluding to, the neurodiverse people within our society have really been struggling and often need a little bit more help and support.
Thanks very much for that comprehensive answer. I'm going to hand over to Anthea now. Is there anything that you would give as advice for specifically targeting children?
Yes. Before I get to that, Sarah, I just want to say, building on what David just said, where children are not neurotypical, are neurodiverse, we also know that often that can run in the family, if you like. So you may also find that you as a parent also realize that your own neurodiversity makes things harder for you, and then you've got the extra layer of having to parent a child who's having that additional challenge as well, and that can really make for a very difficult combination. And recognizing where those things are becoming overwhelming and where you might need additional support to help navigate the multiple layers of that is really important. But just getting to, specific strategies for children, and we have heard already tonight about routine, but one of the things we do know from our studies from the health poll is where children had regular physical activity and were less likely to report loneliness, they had better mental health during the pandemic. So those two things are really practical things that you can try to do with your child that will look different depending on their age. So for very young children, you might not necessarily recognize a concept that they're lonely because they're in the family environment, they might have their siblings to interact with. But in fact, from some studies, we know that even very young children can, whilst being surrounded by family, still experience loneliness. And that's that connectivity with people outside the home. And of course, older children, particularly adolescents and teenagers, are really looking for that connection with their peers. It's very normal developmentally once children enter adolescence and right through into the early 20s that they move from being closely connected, as a primary thing to the family and moving instead to their peers. And lockdown has made that incredibly challenging because it has forced adolescents to be inward again with their immediate family, and really one of the only channels for them to keep that peer engagement active and alive has been through online connection. But that is important. So finding ways for your child, whatever age they are, to stay connected with people outside of the family unit is a really important way to help combat that loneliness, and that will be a protective factor for them for their mental health. Finding ways to factor in the physical activity and adequate sleep are really important as well. And then finally, one other thing to mention is just considering the concept of time for children. So I mentioned it briefly before, but particularly for very young children, it's very difficult for them to remember life before the pandemic. Many of them will not have a recollection of what life was like before. This may have been, you know, a quarter of their life now, certainly a significant period of what they remember. So it's very hard for them to be motivated by looking forward to things getting back to how they used to be, because they really just don't remember what that was like. So instead, just thinking about what's positive that they can relate to in their day-to-day life and in the immediate future is an important way to actually keep children hopeful, so that they can keep getting through day by day as this period does pass.
It's a great point, Anthea, because many of us can't remember what life was like before the pandemic, and it's a significantly greater proportion of a young person's life, isn't it?
It is, that's right. For us, it's a blip, and we still hold on to how things were before. And that's what really motivates us to, you know, stick to perhaps the restrictions or understand that we can get through just a little bit longer. Whereas children, largely, particularly children who are preschool age and in early primary school, really don't have a good recollection of what life was like before the pandemic. It's not something that they will recall, and it's not going to be as meaningful for them. So thinking about trying to put yourself in your child's shoes in lots of ways, and that includes the way they're seeing the world, what their sense of time might be like, and using that as a way to try and frame up what they might look forward to and how they might stay hopeful.
That's great. Thanks very much, Anthea. Lena, anything you'd like to add in terms of strategies for young people?
Yes, I think those that have been mentioned have been fantastic. I think it's really important to have that creation of forward movement in some way, a bit like Zoe was referring to planting the bulbs, but have something that is within the child's control. In a world where other things are out of control, what can they do that's in their control, like redecorate their room or do a favourite hobby or take their dog out or care for something within their purview? That's very helpful. I think also it's important to recognise that we don't know everything, particularly for adolescents, that might be going on in their social groups or their world, and it's very easy to react to lack of communication or irritability, and I think it's important to take a step back and just let them explain what might be going on, or just be there as a gentle support, providing containment. It's a bit like Goldilocks, not too much but not too little either, just enough just to know that you're there as a support should they need you. And I also think sometimes this lack of motivation and the signs of early depression or depressed mood, like not wanting to get up in the morning or engage with school, it might be good to talk with the young person about how they might best interact with school, and contacting school year coordinators to try and talk about how adjustments might be made to help them through this period. I think many schools are starting to adjust their schedules. Some are backing off homework. Others are sort of working with each young person to find something that's suitable for them, to just until they get back on track, not lose connection altogether, because I think that routine's important, but maybe some of the expectations could be changed in some way as they're getting through this period. And I think finally, to add to that, lockdown's one thing, but bad things still happen during lockdown. There might be other sorts of grief and loss and other things that happen, and we have to acknowledge that and manage that too within this context. And there's some wonderful websites that we can make available later, but things like reachout.com, Butterfly Foundation, Beyond Blue, they have some great tips for many of these sorts of issues that might pop up during lockdown for parents and young people to gather information from.
Thanks very much, Lena. That's very important, and I want to come back to David on this, because what sort of resources are there should something go much more awry? So if someone's mental health or well-being is really suffering, And what would you advise as a psychiatrist? Where would you suggest parents and the families and go and look for support or help?
I think if you're worried, then the first person I would go to would be Lena, to your GP. Actually reaching out to, if you've not got other links, if you've not had a previous mental health problem, and this is something new for you, then GP always ought to be the first port of call. If you're an adolescent, then of course Headspace is available to you for those with, I say not serious, but for mental health problems that don't require, for example, a psychiatrist or a psychologist specifically. But not just Lena, psychologists like Michael are incredibly important, although we know that psychologists, psychiatrists, and actually pediatricians as well are not easy to find nowadays. There is, as we're very aware from the recent Royal Commission on Mental Health in Victoria, where we're speaking from, that services to support mental health are not yet adequate. But that shouldn't stop people going to seek them out. And actually, I think one of the reasons that we've been seeing more cases is because we've been talking more about mental health during the lockdown, and people have actually been coming up and saying, yes, this is a problem for me. And that's actually a positive thing, not a negative thing. We did some work not that long ago looking to show that only 50% of those with a diagnosable serious mental health problem had sought any help at all in the last 12 months. And so actually getting people out to go and start talking. And I did want, if I can, just to add to that talking about it side, that one of the other very important things that parents can do is to talk, to self-disclose their own fears and their own worries. People are often worried that if we talk about mental health problems, or if we admit that we have our own mental health worries, it's not talking about serious problems, but even our worries, that if we talk about them, it will make it worse. But we know it's actually one of the things that make things better, is being able to open that discussion. Often young people don't have the language or the ability to actually speak directly to us. But if we start to give them that language and we start to give them that opportunity, that can be really helpful. And not to give up if it doesn't work first time. Somebody might want to say 2 or 3 words to you one day, 1 word to you the next day, but after they get their confidence, start to speak out. So one of the things that is important to do is to share. And that goes both ways. But as Michael said, our job as adults and as parents is to model those positive behaviors and, a bit of self-disclosure about how we're feeling. And we heard that from Zoe at the very, very beginning, to sit next to Archie and say, well, I've been finding it really bloody tough this time. Now, Archie was able to say, don't worry about me so much, Mum, because I'm not feeling it quite so tough this time as I did last time. And those conversations are really, really, really positive and important.
Yeah, thanks, David. Really important points. Archie also mentioned his sort of waxing and waning motivation. And maybe I could ask you, Michael, do you have any tips on how to boost your motivation?
Yeah, I reckon it's a great question. I think for a lot of my students who are coming to me at the moment saying, I don't have any motivation, I try and help them work out their why. Because generally speaking, if you know the benefits of getting something done, I generally find you'll be more motivated to do it. I also am a great believer in just breaking up your work. I don't think we're designed to do 6 hours of work continuously. I do think some of the schools are overloading the kids, while some are, as Lena said, not pulling back a bit. I've got a lot of young people saying to me that they've now got sacks during their school holidays. So I think putting a timer on for 20 minutes, taking a little break, then another 20 minutes. Also, to celebrate your wins, make yourself a kind of to-do list where you write down your achievements, no matter how small. I think tracking your progress can be really helpful. I also want to endorse what the others have said about the importance of exercise, diet and sleep. I think those things are crucial. And if I could put a plug in for a good old-fashioned piece of music, making a playlist of your favorite upbeat songs and listening to them when you need a bit of a push can make a great difference. I also want to endorse what Lena said about reachout.com and 2 brilliant websites, which I'm very keen for people to know about. If you've got a young person with anxiety at the moment, try the Brave program, which is developed by Beyond Blue and the University of Queensland. Really good for anxiety, online cognitive behavioral therapy. Secondly, Mood Gym, developed by Helen Christensen at the ANU when she was there. 7 randomized controlled trials, really fantastic online cognitive behavioral therapy for when you might have some of that irritability that David talked about, feeling a bit down. You don't actually have to wait till you get to see someone like me. That online therapy can be brilliant as well.
That's fantastic. And would you mind, Michael, just popping some of those resources in the chat if you could? I'm sure people would want to have a look at those. And while you're doing that, and before we go to the audience, because there are lots and lots of questions that have been put up in the Q&A, I'm going to give the privilege of wrapping up to Zoe and Archie. There's been a lot of discussion today. Zoe, there was some discussion about strategies for parents. There was, Archie, some comments there about how you can manage things. I think you're doing a great job, as I've mentioned. Perhaps you could just take us into the Q&A by your comments on what you've heard today and anything there that might resonate with you moving forward.
Well, I feel like that. Oh, can you go? No.
All right. Okay. Well, there are a few things. One thing that sort of I was pondering while you were talking there was that there was a moment where Archie sort of did hit a bit of a dip, and because both the kids had been, to my relief, seeming to do okay, I was a little bit blindsided when he suddenly wasn't sleeping and was struggling, and I felt a bit helpless. But one of my strategies was to go to another trusted adult, and in this case it happened to be Archie's football coach, because, you know, exercise is a big motivation for him. So sort of reached out to someone else who was outside the family who could provide some motivational strategies and activities for Archie to do to try to sort of reset his clock a bit. And I think that really helped. I think the other thing that has kind of struck me with these rolling lockdowns too is the emergence from the lockdown, and that kind of sense of, oh, do I really want to come out of this safe bunker now, because I'm not really used to being around people, and also there's all of these issues around being around a lot of people and crowds and such, and also the sense of having to ramp everything up maybe just for a couple of weeks and then to kind of go back into lockdown again. And so that I found that quite discombobulating, particularly when it's a case of, okay, quick kids, we're back to school, footy training's on, soccer's back on, gymnastics is back on, and I've got to try and get my head around where everyone needs to be all of a sudden for 2 or 3 weeks, and then we kind of go into lockdown again. So that's kind of part of the thing that I've been grappling with.
Thanks, Zoe. And Archie, do you have anything that you want to mention quickly before we pile in with some questions?
I feel like from a parent's perspective, I found it much better when it was sort of like soft understanding, like the parent, like especially my parents, it was really helpful when they would understand like how hard it is. Like a few times, especially last year at the start, it would be sort of harsh motivation, like you need to get out, and then it sort of turned into more, you know, you should probably get out, like it's going to be really good for you, and like just not shoving them into it, sort of just slightly pushing them in the right direction and just making sure that they're heading in the right track. And I think another major thing that got me through the last big lockdown was just having whatever it is, like a long sort of driving, I guess, goal. But last year, my mate and I, we had this like hideout out on the beach in the bush, and we would just every day after school go out and go make it and just walk around, and would just have a great time. And then that would be what I'd look forward to after school every day. I'd just think, you know, I can't wait to get out. How can I, you know, get out of school quicker? How can I just get out and go, just be free? Because there was no one there. It'd just be sort of our safe space in which we could do whatever we wanted and just forget about everything else.
That's awesome. And also the first part of your answer about the exercise and getting out there is actually related to the very first question that we're going to ask from the audience today. And I think I'll give this question to Michael first up. How do you encourage children, adolescents who have lost the will to exercise or be outside, want to drop out of sport and are withdrawing into themselves onto their screens? It's like pulling teeth, even if you know it's good for endorphins, etc. So Archie gave a little bit of a good answer there, but what can you add to that, Michael?
Well, I definitely endorse a gentle, kind approach. I don't think that we should be forcing young people. I think yelling and shouting and screaming triggers defensiveness and gets us nowhere. So that whole idea of learners of parents going outside and running on the spots is such a good move for parents who feel the need to sort of get a bit yelly. But what I think we should do is see if we can do a negotiation and incentivize the young person with something that they're looking forward to. And it might be something obviously healthy that they could eat or prepare. It might be a movie or, dare I say, sometimes food that they particularly like, that they want to order via Uber Eats. But I think we need to actually have a principle of you get way more flies with honey, the old carrot rather than the stick. So incentivizing young people to be a bit active is much better than sort of having a bit of a yell fest.
Thank you. I'm going to get through these as many questions as I can. This one I think I will ask to Anthea. My 13-year-old son is showing little interest in his school. How do I get him to school?
Oh, that is a great question, Sarah, and it's such a common experience for people at the moment. I want to use the beautiful term that Archie used before when he was saying things that had worked for him, and that was when people had approached him, his parents and others, with soft understanding. And I think that soft understanding approach is a really beautiful way to talk about empathy. So the first thing is to try and understand what is going on for your young person and meet them in the place that they're at to try and make some progress forward towards getting back into things. So things that don't work well are, you just have to do this, stop whinging about it. You might feel like you're behind, but I told you yesterday you needed to do it, and now the fact that you're 2 days behind, see, that's what I said would happen if you didn't do it. Those sorts of things are going to really generate a lot of anxiety, a lot of defensiveness, and also a feeling of hopelessness and overwhelm. Like it's all too much and I'm just going to give up and pull away. So what I would do is try to talk with your young person and reassure them that even if things are really hard, they might feel like they're very behind, like they've actually lost thread of what's going on, like they don't feel confident or aware how they're going to re-engage with the schooling, that you will help them to perhaps be a bridge with the teacher or whoever is at school that you might be able to communicate with to actually regroup and start again. I would encourage small steps. It doesn't need to be everything. A sense of powering through and catching up is not going to be helpful, but rather taking small steps to actually get back towards a place where you're doing a little bit, hopefully every day. The school is really helpful, as I mentioned, and trying to find someone that you can connect with there who can understand how your young person's feeling and help you to actually get over some of those barriers. And if you're still having trouble, then it might be a situation where you are looking at very low mood. Perhaps your young person's got some signs of depression. Perhaps this is something that is going to be bigger than anything anyone can get around just with, you know, the usual strategies and some energy and motivation. And don't delay in reaching out for help in that sort of situation so that you can try to start to turn things around.
Thanks, Anthea. There are a lot of comments about the loss of important experiences like going to camps and sports, getting a part-time job, just hanging out with friends. I think that some of the comments here in the chat are really giving us an idea of what's going on in the community. But there are lots and lots of questions as well as comments. And this one, I think, Lena, you may be able to answer. It's from a single mother. She says she's here 24/7 with grade 1 and grade 3 children. We three are together all the time. It's unnatural, and I never get 5 minutes alone. I think probably you can also appreciate this, Anthea, of young children. No solution I see other than TV hours. Any tips?
Gosh, yeah, it's a really difficult one, and that feeling of always having to be present and you're on, and as a single parent, that's quite difficult. I think it is important to find ways to support herself and whatever that might be, like having the kids in a very safe spot for even for 5 minutes to take a bit of time away somewhere and do some silent inward meditation, maybe take an online program early in the morning before they're up or late at night, or perhaps there's some connection with a family member that she can engage with online or meet at a park with. And even though you can't use equipment, their kids can run around, and I think you can be with one other person, perhaps where you can share stories, or someone going through the same life experience, or it may be someone elderly that's close. Like if there's any other person and other adult to connect with, I think that would be important. Might have to turn to Anthea too for tips with all the children, but it is tricky to manage that online school, and whether there's any way that schools could help. And in fact, schools are open for some kids, and it might be good to say, look, I actually need a bit of reprieve for a little while. I might put one in at a time or both in for a day or two, and schools are definitely open for that type of relief. And I think it's really important. It's important for your own health and for their health and well-being, and will probably give you some time out that you'll need to get through the other periods. So perhaps some strategies I'd suggest.
Yeah, just to add to that, Lena, absolutely. Certainly people who are solo or single parents, that has been, as a paediatrician, that's absolutely been a group that have found this incredibly challenging and do qualify as being what we call vulnerable in terms of children accessing school. So even if it is one day a week, if that's something that you as a family think might make a difference to your situation, because it is incredibly exhausting to be on 24/7 with young children. And the challenge is, how do you safely have a break? And that's what you're grappling with. One other thing that some families do find helpful, if you do have extended family who may not be able to even visit you at this time, but might be in a position to actually occupy your kids, even for reasonably short periods, but online. So, for example, using a grandparent to actually have a period of time, perhaps reading to a child or chatting with a child, and making a decision that for that short period, even though you're in the home, you're having some mental space. If it's not a grandparent, it might be another close, family friend, or someone who can fill in that space of some digital babysitting so that you can actually have a little bit of mental time out.
Thanks, Anthea. I'll move on. Again, lots and lots of comments here. I think lots of people are very keen to talk about their situations. There are lots and lots of issues that people are bringing up. I'd like to perhaps ask David this question, though. Any advice specifically for those parents with preschool-age children? I have a 3-year-old child and I'm dealing with tantrums. It's challenging with 2 parents working from home and daycare closed. Any tips much appreciated.
This is challenging at the best of times, and even more so when we're in lockdown. I think that what Michael was saying and what Lena and Anthea have said before about being positive, looking for the positives and not getting caught up in the negative escalation of behavior. One of the things that we haven't actually mentioned, and I noticed it in some other questions, and I think is important, particularly when you're dealing with, well, actually with all children, is that physical activity is one of the things that we know supports well-being, but being creative is the other. So actually being creative is as positive to mental health as physical exercise is. So I think looking for things that you can do that will keep your 3-year-old occupied. 3-year-olds don't stay occupied for very long, so you need a bit of a long list for them. But I think there are many supports out there that we can find about things that I can do, things that we can do together that will be fun. You know, it might be stirring the cake batter. It might just be coloring in. It might be ripping up pieces of paper and sticking them on with glue. But actually doing something creative, looking for the positives and building those positives in again with the rewards of attention. One of the problems that we have when we get irritated with our children, and I say our because none of us are immune to it, is that we get irritated and we turn away, and we need that sort of space away. But of course, that then can increase the irritation and the irritability in the child. So the best time to give attention is when you can give it and divert it and build the positives there, rather than sort of take a break at that point. So be creative. Again, the physical activity, but also looking after yourself. Relaxation and mindfulness techniques are hugely important. So look after yourself. I think Michael said at the beginning, take your air mask first. Make sure that your health and mental health are good.
David, I think we may have to finish there with the comment, look after yourself. And I think that's particularly important because there are well over 100 questions in the chat that we obviously haven't got time to get through today. It shows how important this issue is. And I think we should perhaps, after this meeting over the next few days, look at some of those answers and see how we may be able to help people and perhaps share some of the resources we put up here in the chat in a coordinated manner. But that's really the end of the time for tonight's panel discussion. I should thank the panelists and everyone for joining us. I hope that some of the practical suggestions have been helpful. It's been a real pleasure to ask these questions of our excellent panel. And thank you for Kate Anderson and Casey Anderson for help in organising. I'm going to hand back to Professor Jane Gunn, the Dean of the Faculty of Medicine, Dentistry and Health Sciences. Jane.
Thanks so much, Sarath. And I hope that everyone has really enjoyed the panel this evening. I thank all of our presenters, especially Aki and Zoe for joining us this evening. I found it a really interesting panel discussion. And I think out of it, one of the most important things is that we are hopeful about the future, that we do know that this will pass. There will be better times ahead. And I hope that you've found that there's some useful tips that you can take away. Exercise, crafts, being there with each other, and thinking of fun things to do in the future. And for those of you who are struggling, please do reach out. We will be in contact over coming weeks to everyone who's joined for the webinar, and there will be some follow-up information sent to you. You can follow us on Twitter. I'm sure that's going to be put in the chat and we'll send it out. And we do hope that you've enjoyed this In Pursuit of Health series this evening. Take care, everyone.